What's up, buddies? Welcome back. If you've been watching the channel for some time now, you know that we're deep in the weeds looking into the PCV system of the MK7 MQB platform. And with our newly retrofitted crankcase pressure sensor, which isn't on here right this second, but went ahead and refitted the MK7 BL valve, stock turbo inlet pipe, and I did a few runs with aftermarket turbo inlet, with an aftermarket turbo inlet pipe as well. We'll get more to that soon. However, I figured I'd take this time to kind of go through the MK8 Retrofit install. I had a request from a few people. This isn't going to be a super duper in-depth thing, but going to try and help through some of the parts that'll be more of a pain in the ass. For starters, the parts that you're going to need: the MK7 PCV valve itself. You're going to need the 2022 Tiguan PCV hose. You're going to need a dummy sensor cap to install, basically to plug this hole because, well, this is $3 instead of $35 to $60 for the OEM sensor. And then this is just a generic 3/8 vacuum cap. You can pick one of these things up at any parts store. You're going to be using it if you're doing a basic retrofit to stick on the end of the Venturi fitting. If you are doing a full retrofit, then this part is not needed. First things first, we're going to take just a little dab of engine oil, get it right there, and just kind of smear it all over the O-ring. That way, lube this thing up so we can stick it into the PCV itself. And boom, it's in place. It's going to wiggle around a little bit, and that's fine. It seals on the O-ring. And this thing is never under any kind of significant pressure, or it's actually never under any pressure, but it'll be under, you know, just vacuum, so it's fine. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove this intake tube. So I'm going to take a 7mm socket and this little fella. Obviously, if you don't have an air ratchet, that's fine. Using a regular 1/4-inch ratchet works just fine as well. Some pliers. I usually just pinch this, remove the whole thing off, and let it rest back on in the groove. Pull everything off and set it aside. Next up, if it's possible, we're going to disconnect this little fella off of the turbo inlet pipe if possible. Don't pay any attention to this. This is because I've already done the full retrofit on my car, so this is what normally powers the Venturi hose on the top of that Tiguan hose. I generally like to disconnect the charge actuator or whatever the hell thing first, and all that you do is you push in on the connector and apply a little bit of pressure here and then pull up. I just kind of disconnect that to get a little bit of more room. And then if you're lucky, you might be able to just muscle fuck this thing out of here and yank up on it. I'm usually not that lucky, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So what I generally do instead is pull this hose off right here, snake it through everything, and so that is what we're going to do, so I can show you in a little bit more detail how to pry it off without breaking it. So now we're going to go down the line, start disconnecting the coil pack connectors. If you haven't done these before, if you push on this little tab, usually you'll hear an audible click. If you start pulling and it does not want to come, generally pushing inwards, pressing upwards on that tab, and then giving it some upwards pressure, you can feel it pop. So we're just going to go down the line doing that. Again, now this last one, I have a broken tab. So what I typically do is take a small pick like this, and all that I do is slip it up under so you can feel it pushing upwards on the tab from the bottom side. There we go, and you hear it click. Then you can give it upwards force and go on with removing it like usual. So we're going to just slide everything up and clear. And I generally just rest it up a little bit right there. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove coil packs numbers 4 and 3. These are 5mm, I think, Allens, due to the kit I have installed. Normally they're 10mm. This one you don't technically need to remove, but it does give you so much more room. So we're gonna go ahead and remove these. Set the bolts aside. Now, normally these coil pack studs in factory form have it's a 10mm nut, then a 10mm stud. Generally, you want to use a 10mm thin wrench, slip it on the bottom, on the stud 10mm portion. As you loosen the top, you can get one of these Capri brand wrenches for cheap on Amazon. Definitely recommend them. Back to the coil pack removal. We're going to just kind of muscle these things out of here, pulling straight up and trying to be as careful as we can with the harness stuff right there. Pull it straight up and yank it out. It can be a pain, so just be aware of that. So at this point, in order to remove this hose, we're going to remove this T30 Torx right here. Next, we're going to attempt to slip this PCV hose off with the turbo inlet pipe still attached. So now we need to access this T30 Torx holding the turbo inlet pipe on right there. Get that little fella out of there. Now to disconnect this hose, there is actually a small tab, not sure if you can see it quite on video, at the bottom here that is attempting to keep this whole thing installed. So we're going to kind of push down on that and pry around and separate it there. Now, all that I'm using for this is a radiator hose pick. Obviously you don't have to have a snap-on one. Harbor Freight has some equivalent stuff as well, I'm fairly certain. So go ahead and just pry on this little fella here. Bit of a pain in the ass. There we go. All right, so once we have that separated, we're going to go ahead and rotate the entire turbo inlet pipe backwards as we simultaneously snake this little guy through here. Go ahead and document the struggle right here. This thing is a little bit of a pain in the ass to get through here, but it is indeed possible. So we're gonna go ahead and twist the turbo inlet pipe backwards, being mindful of this rubber coolant hose that is right behind it. Kind of shove it out of the way as we twist it. And once the turbo inlet pipe is back far enough, it can pop out. So that gives us a little bit more room to snake this hose through. Well, man, I definitely got it out like this once before, but it was a pain in the ass. However, this does give us enough access to try and get this thing off. So the way I typically do this, so once it's at this point, what I typically do is just take a little pocket screwdriver, shove it straight down at 90 degrees to the hose. So this is facing that way, so as close to us on the camera. Shove it in there and just give it a little nudge, and then it comes right off. So at this point, we can snake this stupid hose back through the other way, because this fitting fits through a whole lot easier, and have that thing, where's the camera? Have that thing removed. Now we can finally move on to the actual PCV install itself. Well, removal to do the Mark 8 install. I have a hose clamp here because the Mark 8 valve I've already had on my car before, and I replaced it with that. I normally, when changing the valve, I disconnect this connector right here. You just pull the little clip out and squeeze and wiggle that little guy out of there. Set it aside. And then I like to pull this up. So you've got a bunch of free room, and once we disconnect this hose, we can actually pull this thing all the way out. There is a harness that clips onto this hose right here, which makes it a little bit awkward, but not unmanageable. Like I said, normally you'll have a little hose clampy clip right here, but I've already replaced mine with one of these, so here we are. So just going to yank that out of there, and pull it right out of that hose clamp. Alrighty, so, and you can see having everything disconnected just gives you tons of room to work with, so that's always nice. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the 7 T30 Torx bits. Not a bad idea if your engine is very dirty to go ahead and just spray off everything in this area first. That way you don't have as high a chance of dirt and grit and stuff falling in. But my car is clean enough already. Oop, one more. When it comes to removing this thing, if it's hard, you can see how loose this is. If it's hard to remove, stop what you're doing and double check everything. So at this point, we are good to remove it. And there's the bottom side of this BL valve. All right, so at this point, we can take a look at our intake camshaft and see that nothing is horrible looking, which is great. You can see this is the pathway where the car has the vacuum source at idle and very, very low loads. This is the oil blow-by port that goes down to the bottom end. This is the oil drain port where oil from the air oil separator drips back down. And this is where some of the residual stuff gets dumped out of the valve, assuming it has enough time to get dripped out of there for anything that does happen to make it through. It is important to note that the BL and the BK and the Mark 8 valves do not drain or suction anywhere inside of here worth mentioning. So I've done a really quick inspection. I like to just take a basic blue lint-free paper towel and just get any of the oil off of the sealing surface. That way we don't have any stuff bleed out after we install the new valve. I apologize for my hand being in the way, but I'm right-handed and there's not really a much better place to anchor the camera just yet. If I start doing this shit more often, I might have to invest in some better solutions for making videos that suck less. So yeah, everything is dried off where the gaskets are going to be sealing. So at this point, we are going to grab our Mark 8 valve and just drop it right on. And what I typically like to do, I never start these things by anything other than just threading by hand. The threads in the cylinder head are very, very soft, and you do not want to strip any of them because that is going to suck. And I just start every single one of them by hand. Make sure they go in smoothly. If the threads are rough, give them a little wiggle. That basically recenters everything. So we're doing that. And one very important thing to note is that these things, tightening them more does not make it seal any better. These are shouldered bolts. So that means once the bolt bottoms out, it's actually the bolt bottoming out on the cylinder head, well, on the cam cover, and not the gasket or the PCV. I mean, the PCV is seated because I'm going to assume that Volkswagen spec'd this stuff correctly. But if we take a look here, I have another Mark 8 valve. You can see here how that bolt has a little shoulder on it. Once this little piece bottoms out on the cylinder head, tightening it anymore is not going to do anything except for strip the threads. So we are not going to use an impact to tighten this thing. I don't even use a torque wrench because Generally, you get a little bit better by just going by feel. I was a mechanic for 17 years, so this is not unheard of. But just, you know, a couple fingers on the ratchet. Once it gets stiff, stop. Go opposite. Stop. And just continue this all the way around. And once resistance is felt, you stop, because it will go up dramatically once it's bottomed out. Then I'll go back and I just give it a little nudge afterwards. It's not enough to, you know, damage stuff. It just has to be enough to not come loose. These things aren't under any kind of like stress. So don't go crazy over torquing these stupid bolts, because you'll be in for a world of hurt if you strip one out. So at this point, I'm actually going to be installing this turbo inlet pipe on my car. As you know, I've been trying to test some things to see their effect on the PCV system. The factory turbo inlet pipe has that little protrusion that can be seen through the inlet there. This is looking from the turbocharger. I believe that this little bump creates a low pressure zone, which allows the PCV to pull more vacuum. Maybe not necessarily to have more vacuum overall, but to have more vacuum earlier at lower RPMs to maintain the diaphragm position either more closed and or just keep the crankcase under vacuum as consistently as possible. This Epman brand turbo inlet pipe I picked up off of Amazon for 45 bucks because I frankly am not going to spend $200 on a turbo inlet pipe, but this looks like a pretty darn good knockoff of an APR one. The quality of this is kind of definitely not going to be able to use it right out of the box. Some problems that I had: one, everything like on the inside was covered in metal shavings, like maybe not metal shavings, but metal dust. You could swipe it with your finger and come out gray. Obviously, you don't want to be putting all that shit through your engine. All of the machining, all of the final machining on every one of these 90-degree edges, such as like right beside these O-rings and stuff, are sharp. So I carefully removed this gasket, which it did come with, and I filed the very edges. I chamfered everything down. I chamfered down this edge here. On the inside of this turbo outlet, you can kind of see some crummy machining right there. Honestly, this looks like it's probably like an APR reject or something, and then it's being resold by whoever in China actually makes them for APR. So yeah, I went ahead and filed down some of the rough edges right there that were left from the final machining, or what shouldn't have been final machining. This little piece right here actually can thread out. So just make sure that that thing is tight and sealed. There should be some kind of a sealant in there, which there is. And lastly, the biggest problem that I ran into was this little mounting tab. This little guy here was actually bent downwards. So this hole didn't even line up with the turbo itself when trying to just dry fit it and make sure. Obviously, you don't want to have this bolt hole off center, because if you try and tighten it, you're going to either strip it out or cross thread it or something. I actually undid I believe it was a 3mm hex, undid that. And when I removed this little pole, there was, from this thing being inserted into the aluminum turbo inlet pipe, it was actually dragging. The top edge of this was sharp because, again, nothing is like machined really well or finished, and it was dragging the aluminum and scraping a bit of the aluminum off, and then the aluminum was compacted underneath the top only of this little piece. So as a result, when this screw was tight, it was cocked downwards. So all that I did was remove this, took a file around the edges of where this piece slides in, took a pick, and I cleaned out the insides, the innards of this. So it can work. Again, like some of the machining is kind of like you can see some rough stuff, but I mean, for just a tube that I need to test, I really don't care. It's going to be close enough to at least rule out this thing not working, and all the dimensions of this, the inside and the outside inner diameters, or the inlet and the outlet inner diameters, match up what Jeff on mygolfmark7.com measured. So I'm pretty confident that this is indeed dimensionally accurate to an APR. It just might be a very poor quality version of it. So again, not sure if it's any good yet or even worth putting on the car. I just wanted to spend as little as possible for testing purposes and see if I could get some kind of a change out of the PCV system. So moving on with the install, we're going to put our hose back in that goes to the N80 purge valve for starters. You want to make sure you have whatever clip you're going to be using on. I replaced it with this hose clamp just because that makes things much easier. Slip it on here. Now the outlet on this PCV is actually just marginally bigger. This is still the factory Mark 7 hose, but it's going to give you a little bit of a fight trying to install it. So we're going to do that, and it does help if you have a pair of needle nose pliers or something. Hose clamp pliers would actually probably be even better. And you just wiggle it back and forth while you're giving it inward pressure. And we get it installed enough to fit. And we can also take this little fella here, shove that right back on, and then plug in our N80 purge valve, resecure the lock. And the reason this was such a pain was probably because I did not loosen this quite enough. It was loosened enough to fit on the Mark 7 valve, but not for the Mark 8. So, all right, there we go. So I'll just go ahead and tighten this down as well. And this is never under any kind of boost or anything, so it does not have to be like crazy, crazy tight. You can reuse the little pinch clip connector, but it's a little bit of a pain. So if you can pick up a hose clamp from a parts store, I advise it just for future headaches. And you also want to not forget about this little clamp clip hingy right there for this wire harness. Next, we're going to go ahead and install our turbo inlet. At this point, you can take a rag and just wipe out your turbo outlet. I don't actually really have much of anything in there because everything's been good lately. So anyways, when we're installing the turbo outlet, you can see the 3 little tabs it has on it. Basically, those index on those tabs in the turbo. It does help to take just a little bit of oil or a little dab of grease and smear it on this O-ring to make things a little bit easier to go in. So we do that, and then snake the turbo inlet in here and try and install it as straight and square as possible. Balls. There we go. And I'm not sure if you can tell in the video, but this bolt hole lines up pretty darn straight, so we can install that little fella right now. Always, always, always start by hand tightening it. It goes nice all the way in by hand without any problems. So again, not a fan of torquing the piss out of things, so just enough to snug it, keep it in place. So there is our turbo inlet pipe. Now, one thing, if you are doing a full retrofit, using the Venturi, at this point you would install the 034 turbo inlet pipe, turbo muffler delete, which I have already covered before. Was not really a how-to video, but you can look up any number of how-to videos on installing turbo muffler deletes and get the information that you need. I'll put a link to my video specific to the fittings and parts used for the full retrofit in the description, along with the actual parts that I used. Just a reminder that this is all still in testing, so do this at your own risk. Now, if you have done the full retrofit, you're going to have this hose coming off of your turbo muffler delete, which is what I used in my case. And I just route it straight up and over the charge actuator, whatever the turbo actuator thing, and basically just have it right here ready to go on the Tiguan outlet. And that is just the hose that comes on this thing from the factory. So now we can snake this hose back through there, and it's very, very easy compared to the stock one. You're just going to slip it through there. And we can snap this little fella on. And there we go there. I'm gonna move my Venturi hose out of the way. So at that point, we're gonna go ahead and install this down. Chances are you will hear a click. Okay, there we go, it's secure. It goes. So if you did the full retrofit, obviously you're not gonna have the bolt inside the end of this hose. You would connect to this right here, and you'd be good to go there as far as the Venturi goes. You can also take this time to reinstall the turbo actuator, wastegate actuator, and then you can go ahead and throw our ignition coils back in as well. And then we'll take this, put those back in, and find the rudder for that. Again, being very careful about snugging everything. Once it's tight, then just another quick little oomph, and you're good to go. I'm doing a quick once over of everything. If you did the basic retrofit, you can install the plug over this. Our last little bit of business is to throw the intake piping back on, so we will go ahead and do that. Screwdriver. Dang it, not screwdriver, fucking pliers. That on. Oops. And we can take this and tighten this fella down. Make sure that it's seated all the way. Alrighty. So before we do anything, we're going to do a quick once over. Make sure that one, of course, the PCV, all of the 7, I think, bolts are tightened. Make sure that you have this sensor dummy plug installed. Make sure that this hose is secure to the PCV. We'll make sure that the Tiguan hose is secure to the turbo inlet pipe. If you're doing a basic retrofit, then you will have a 3/8 inner diameter cap. It does not have to be like crazy tight. It just has to be enough to stay on, because this is never under boost unless you have a Venturi running through it. If you're running the Venturi, then doing the full retrofit, then you will have a hose coming from your either turbo muffler delete or your charge pipe in between the turbo outlet and the intercooler. So if that's the case, then instead of the cap, this hose will go here. Make sure that this is tight. Make sure that if you remove the turbo inlet pipe, this bolt is back on. Make sure your air filter or the air box to your air tube, whatever, is installed as it should. Make sure that your hose to your N80 purge valve is good. Make sure that the purge valve is installed, or the plug is installed. Make sure all your coil packs are tight and everything is good there. So like I said, this was more so a video of opportunity. It wasn't originally planned. I had the Mark 7 BL valve put on my car for crankcase pressure testing reasons, and I had a few people request to do a how-to on the retrofit, so there you go. So now that I've got the Mark 8 valve back on, I've got some more science experiments planned so that we can get to the bottom of exactly why the factory PCV valve is so heavily reliant on an OEM turbo inlet pipe, and why the Venturi with a full retrofit is going to be the answer.